He tore the necklace from my neck with a hand I once taught how to hold a spoon. That chain wasn't just metal. It carried the warmth of my mother's hands, the prayers of her nights, and the strength of her silence. It had passed from her to me on the day I buried her, and I had worn it every day since, like a promise. When he ripped it off, I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I stood still, looking at the boy I once rocked to sleep, now glaring like I was nothing. He said, with a voice colder than I'd ever heard, "You're dead to me." I bent down, picked up the broken chain from the floor, brushed the dust off it gently, and whispered just one thing before I turned away. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Before I tell you what happened next, I want to say thank you for being here, for listening, for sitting with me in this moment. I don't know where you're watching from or what weight you're carrying tonight, but I hope you know this is a safe place to rest your heart for a little while. Sometimes we think we're the only ones holding pain this quiet, but I've learned we're not. Maybe you've come here because something inside you cracked once. Maybe you trusted someone who turned their back. Maybe you were called a liar when you were only ever honest. If any of that feels close to home, you're not alone. And if you've been through something like this, where love and loyalty were twisted against you, please share your story with me below. Or just say, "I'm healing now." That's enough. My name is Dolores. I'm 71 years old, and I gave my life to that boy without keeping a single piece of it for myself. I became a mother early, and I became a widow even earlier. Life didn't ask me if I was ready. It just handed me a baby and a folded flag and said, "Figure it out." So I did. I worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3 when the holidays came around. I cleaned houses during the day, took care of an old man overnight, and baked for the church on weekends just to make ends meet. There were nights I went to bed hungry because I needed to stretch the groceries to make it through the week, and shoes I wore until they nearly fell apart, so he'd never have to wear hand-me-downs. I never let him see how tired I was, and I never asked him for anything. Every birthday, every school trip, every scraped knee, I was there. He was my whole reason for getting up every morning, and I never once thought I'd regret that. When he brought her home, I smiled like I meant it. Her name was Chelsea. Pretty thing, well-spoken, nails always done, perfume that filled the whole house. At first she was kind. Said please and thank you, offered to wash the dishes once or twice. But the warmth didn't last long. The smiles got tighter, the visits shorter, the conversations clipped. She started correcting him in front of me, started giving him that look when I talked too long, like she was counting the seconds. I stayed quiet. I thought maybe she was just tired or trying to adjust, or maybe I was imagining things. But I wasn't. Chelsea didn't just want him. She wanted everything that came with him. And slowly, she made it clear I was in the way. I've come to understand something hard. Sometimes people don't marry into love. They marry into opportunity. And when the opportunity doesn't move fast enough, they start pushing things out of their way. Even the hands that once held them gently. Even the woman who gave everything just to keep a roof over their heads. It started with a missing bracelet. Just a small thing. Nothing expensive, nothing flashy. Something I'd had for years, tucked in a velvet pouch at the back of my drawer. I hadn't worn it in a long time, but I remembered exactly where I left it. One day I went to look for it, and it was gone. I asked gently if anyone had seen it, but Chelsea just shrugged and said maybe I misplaced it. My son didn't even look up from his phone. I tried not to think too much of it. I told myself maybe I had moved it and forgotten, even though I knew I hadn't. Then a week later, it was a check I'd written for groceries. It had vanished too. I checked my purse 3 times. Nothing. When I asked about it, Chelsea gave me a look like I'd asked something foolish, and my son put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Mom, maybe you need help. You've been forgetting things lately." That one sentence sank deep into my chest. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. But inside me, something shifted. I started watching things more closely. I made little notes for myself. I kept track of where I left every item, every key, every receipt. But the more careful I became, the more things kept going missing. And slowly they started treating me like a burden. Like I was more work than worth. They began whispering when they thought I was asleep. Doors were closed that used to be open. Conversation stopped when I walked into the room. Chelsea would glance at me, then at him, and he'd nod like something had already been decided. They stopped asking how my day was. They stopped sitting with me at dinner. When I did speak, Chelsea would smile and say, "You already told us that," even when I knew I hadn't. It was a quiet kind of dismissal, wrapped in politeness, masked as care. I started to feel invisible in my own home, like a piece of furniture they were too polite to throw out but too tired to dust. I remember standing in the kitchen one evening, holding a cup of tea that had gone cold in my hands, and hearing her say, "We need to think about what's best for her. She's clearly not all there anymore." My son didn't say anything. He just sighed like he agreed. And that silence? It was louder than any accusation. When the knock came at the door that evening, I thought it was the neighbor's boy returning my pie tin. I had just finished folding a small basket of laundry, the last of it, and the house was so quiet I could hear the clock ticking in the hallway. But when I opened the door, it wasn't a child holding a dish. It was two officers in uniform, standing there with clipped expressions and questions they already knew the answers to. One of them spoke kindly, the way someone does when they don't want to stir the water too fast. He said there had been a report that certain items had gone missing, valuable ones, and that someone in the house believed I might have taken them. I stood still, blinking, trying to understand the words, trying to make sense of how we got here. Behind them, standing just inside the living room, was my son. He didn't look at me, not really. He stared past me, arms folded, jaw set. And behind him, on the edge of the couch, Chelsea sat with her legs crossed, her eyes fixed on me like I was a stranger in their home. I asked if they had a warrant. The officer said no, but asked if I would cooperate. I nodded. Not because I was guilty, but because I had nothing to hide. I led them into my room, my small room at the end of the hallway with the soft green curtains and the quilt I made the winter after my husband passed. They opened drawers, lifted cushions, peered behind books on my shelf. I watched their hands move through my life, careful but invasive, and I felt a stillness settle over me like a thick winter fog. Then one of them opened the old cedar box at the back of my closet, the one I used to keep letters and photos in. Inside, he pulled out a pouch. I'd never seen it before, but he opened it and held up a pair of earrings, a gold bracelet, and a thin diamond ring I didn't recognize. He looked at me, not accusingly, but with something almost like regret. I said nothing. Not because I didn't want to speak, but because my voice had gone somewhere too far to reach. My son stepped forward and said, "That's Chelsea's. She's been looking everywhere for that." His voice was flat, rehearsed, like he was reading lines from a page. Chelsea stood now, arms crossed, her mouth turned in a careful line of concern. The officers asked if I had anything to say. I shook my head, not because I agreed, but because I didn't know how to explain what they clearly didn't want to understand. One of them gently suggested I seek some help, maybe see a doctor, maybe talk to someone. I nodded again, numb, still frozen. Then they left. No arrest, no formal charges, just quiet, heavy judgment hanging in the air. As the door closed behind them, I turned slowly toward the hallway, where he still stood watching me. He didn't speak. His eyes didn't soften. I thought maybe I'd see some hesitation, some flicker of the boy I once knew. But there was nothing. And in that moment, standing in the house I helped build, surrounded by the life I gave him, I realized I was no longer part of it. Not truly. Not to them. Chelsea reached for his hand. He didn't resist. And somewhere, deep inside me, I felt something crack. Not loud, not violent, just a quiet, final shift. The kind of break that doesn't heal the same. He stood there in the hallway, watching me like I was nothing more than a problem he'd finally solved. His arms were still crossed, but his eyes had that distant, glassy look. The kind people get when they've already convinced themselves they're right. I opened my mouth to say something, I don't even know what. But before a word could leave me, he stepped forward, fast, with a kind of finality in his movements that made my skin go cold. His hand went straight for my neck, and without hesitation, he yanked. The chain snapped in an instant. The metal didn't stand a chance against his strength or his anger. I didn't cry out. I didn't flinch. I just stood there as the necklace, my mother's necklace, the one I wore through every season of his life, from his first step to his first job, fell to the floor in a quiet tangle of gold. That necklace had touched 3 generations of women. It had been given to me the night my own mother passed, placed in my palm with her last bit of strength, a symbol of resilience and memory and blood. I wore it when I gave birth, when I buried my husband, when I walked through snow to catch the early bus just to clean someone else's floors so he could have a better life. That necklace had soaked up my tears, had rested against my chest when I held him close after bad dreams, had never once left my skin. Not until that moment. The silence after he tore it off felt louder than the knock from the officers, louder than Chelsea's whispers, louder than every insult they dressed up in polite tones. I looked down at the floor, at that small glimmer of chain lying on the tile like a discarded memory. Then I looked up at him, and that's when he said it. Cold, sharp, without a flicker of hesitation. "You're dead to me." The words didn't hit like fire, they hit like frost. Slow, quiet, deadly. I bent down, knees aching, and picked up what was left of the chain. My hands didn't shake. I brushed the floor dust off it gently, almost like it was a child again. Then I stood straight, looked him in the eye, and I didn't say much. Just one thing. One whisper. "You don't know who you're dealing with." I turned away after that. I didn't wait for a response. I didn't look back. And in that quiet turn, something in me shifted. Not in anger, not in revenge, just a clear understanding. That's when I knew it was over. Not just the argument, not just the evening, but us. The bond, the trust, the years. I realized they had ended long before he tore that necklace off. I just hadn't seen it until now. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of my bed, the broken necklace resting in my lap, the air still heavy with everything left unsaid. The house was quiet, but not the peaceful kind of quiet. It was the kind that hums with something cold underneath. I looked around the room, at the photos on the wall, the quilt I'd stitched with my own hands, the books on the nightstand I never got around to finishing. And then I stood, slow and certain, and opened the old cedar trunk at the foot of my bed. I hadn't touched it in years. It still smelled faintly of pine and thyme. Inside were folders, envelopes, leather-bound ledgers, things my husband had left me when he passed. He told me once, "Keep these safe, Dolores. They'll never expect you to hold the power, and that's what makes it real." I packed only one bag. I didn't need much. A change of clothes, a small tin of tea leaves I kept for hard mornings, and the thick binder of documents they forgot I had. Deeds, stock records, a notarized will they'd never seen. My name was on everything. The house, the accounts, the business. All quietly transferred to me before my husband died, out of love, out of respect, out of trust. I never flaunted it. Never spoke of it. Because I never thought I'd need to remind anyone of what I held. But that night, I did. I placed the binder carefully between my sweaters, zipped the bag, tucked the broken necklace into the side pocket. Then I walked down the hallway slowly, passing the living room where they'd sat earlier like nothing had happened. The lights were off now. The silence was thick. I didn't leave a note. I didn't leave a key. I didn't say goodbye. I walked out the door I'd unlocked for them every day for years, and I closed it gently behind me. They thought I was just an old woman. That I didn't know how to manage things. That my silence meant weakness, and my hands were too tired to hold anything of value. But I held the keys. Not just to the house, not just to the accounts, but to the whole future they were standing on. And I had just walked out the door with it. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel angry. I felt clear. Like I had finally stepped out of a long fog into the cold night air, with the stars above and the truth in my hands. They didn't notice I was gone at first. I wasn't surprised. I had made myself small in that house for so long that my absence felt no louder than my presence. I imagine they woke up late, like they often did on weekends, thinking I was in the kitchen making coffee or folding clothes the way I always did. Maybe they noticed the tea tin was missing. Maybe not, but the moment didn't come until they tried to pay for something, groceries or gas, or maybe one of Chelsea's salon visits, and the card didn't go through. They probably thought it was a glitch. Banks make mistakes, systems go down, it happens. But then it happened again, and again. And then the phone call started. I had changed everything quietly. By the time the sun had risen on that morning, the locks on the accounts were in place. Access suspended, all electronic privileges disabled. I hadn't emptied anything. I wasn't interested in revenge, but I had made sure that what belonged to me was no longer in reach of the ones who stood by and called me a thief. The business account, frozen. The shared credit line, cut. Their names removed from every document they had once taken for granted. The same hands that ripped the necklace from my neck now found themselves reaching for doors that no longer opened, for balances that no longer showed their names. And then came the knock at the door, not from me this time, but from a courier. A thick envelope addressed in clean, firm lettering. Inside were notices, formal and final, a certified copy of the deed showing the home had been legally sold. Not transferred. Sold. Signed and completed while they were too busy looking through drawers and pointing fingers. I didn't gloat. I didn't watch from behind bushes or wait for tears. I sat in a quiet room, sipping tea from a chipped cup, the same one I'd used during those sleepless nights when I held that boy in my arms and prayed I'd be enough for him. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. This wasn't about punishment. This was about truth. Truth they tried to bury under shame. Truth they tried to dress up as confusion and forgetfulness. Truth they thought I had lost track of. But I hadn't. I knew exactly where I'd put it. I carried it out with me that night in a single, worn-out suitcase. They thought I was soft, that I would stay silent no matter what they did, that I wouldn't know how to protect what I had built. But it turns out the silence they mistook for weakness was simply patience. And when the day came, I didn't need to raise my voice. The documents spoke for me. The signatures spoke for me. The empty house and the missing access. That was my voice. I just let the truth do what it does best. Stand still and wait to be seen. And now I'll ask you something. What would you do if someone you raised turned on you, not with words, but with greed? Not with fists, but with silence and schemes? Would you shout? Would you fight? Or would you walk away quietly, knowing the ground beneath them was yours all along? I didn't leave a mess behind. I didn't slam the door or tip over any chairs. I left only what needed to be left. A single envelope sitting right in the center of the kitchen table. I made sure it couldn't be missed. I placed it under the edge of the fruit bowl, just enough showing to catch the eye, just enough weight to make it matter. I wrote their names on the front in my own hand, careful and neat, the way I used to sign his school permission slips. I didn't write much inside. I didn't need to. There are moments in life when explaining things feels too small for the truth. And this was one of them. The letter didn't ask for understanding. It didn't beg for kindness. It didn't plead for what was already gone. It confirmed what they had done and what I had done in return. I wrote, "You made your choice. So I made mine. You called me a thief, even after everything I gave, but I was the owner all along, of the house, of the name, of the history you tried to rewrite in your favor. You let her words become louder than mine. You let her whisper twist into truth because it was easier to believe I was the problem than to admit what she was doing. I watched you stand beside her as she accused me, smiled as she nodded, said nothing when they searched through my things like I was some stranger. That silence spoke louder than any words you've ever said to me. Then I wrote the part that took me the longest. I forgive you, but I don't trust you. Those two things are not the same. Forgiveness is a gift I give myself so I can breathe without choking on anger. Trust is something earned, and you gave it away, cheaply, quickly, without hesitation. I once believed love was enough to build a foundation that couldn't crack, but now I understand love without respect is just a house with no walls, easy to enter, easy to leave. Nothing keeping the cold out. I didn't sign the letter with love. I signed it with strength, my full name, the name your father gave me. The name tied to every account, every deed, every share you thought belonged to you. I sealed it, left it in the quiet of the kitchen I once filled with the smell of warm bread and good memories. And then I walked away. By the time they found it, it was too late. The papers were already signed. The accounts were already adjusted. The new locks had already been turned. I imagined Chelsea read it first. I imagined she didn't understand half of it. But I bet the weight of those last 3 lines stayed in her chest longer than she expected. And I bet he read it after she left the room, maybe hoping it would end differently, maybe hoping I'd left a door open. But I hadn't, not this time. There are truths that arrive softly, and then there are truths that slam shut like a gate behind you. That letter was mine. It didn't come with a key, just the echo of a mother who had finally learned how to close the door. I bought a small place near the water, nothing grand, just peaceful. The kind of place where the mornings don't rush you, where the breeze slips through the window and carries no voices, no demands, just the scent of the sea and the sound of birds that seem to know when to stay quiet. The first morning I woke there, I didn't unpack. I just made tea, stood barefoot by the window and let the steam warm my face as the sky slowly turned gold. There was no one calling from the hallway, no slamming doors, no footsteps behind me waiting for something. Just the soft hum of the old radio I brought with me, and the sound of my own breath, steady, unhurried, whole. I started writing again. Not for anyone else, just for me. Pages filled with memories, reflections, pieces of a life I never had time to sit with before. I kept a small notebook by my bed, where I wrote down things I noticed for the first time in years. The way the sun settled on the table at noon. The quiet rhythm of the ceiling fan. The way the floorboards creaked only when I stood in certain spots, like the house itself was learning me gently. It was the kind of silence that doesn't accuse you. It holds you. It lets you unfold. I found a shelter not too far from the cottage. They needed help folding laundry, organizing supplies, writing thank you cards for donors. I went once, then again, then every week. And there, among strangers, I found pieces of myself I had forgotten. The women there didn't ask questions. They just handed me baskets and smiled like I belonged. Sometimes, I'd stay after and write letters, short messages of encouragement to women in prison I'd never met. Words that might remind them of who they were before the world named them something else. Words I wished someone had written to me when I started fading into the background of my own life. I didn't talk about what happened. Not at first. Not with anyone. But the weight began to lift, bit by bit, not because I forgot, but because I remembered myself. Not the version that bent to stay in the room. Not the version that kept the peace by staying silent. The real one. The woman who stitched her own clothes, baked bread with bare hands, handled business meetings with a firm voice when her husband was too sick to attend. The woman who had been there all along, under the layers of apology and service, just waiting for the quiet to make space for her again. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't waiting on anyone's approval. I wasn't walking on eggshells, or wondering if I'd said too much or not enough. I wasn't listening for footsteps or measuring my worth against how useful I'd been that day. I was just living. Not as a mother, not as a caretaker, but as myself. And that, I've learned, is a kind of freedom no one can take back once you've tasted it. He came a year later. No call, no warning. Just a knock on the door that sounded too soft to belong to someone who once spoke so loud. I was peeling apples at the table when I heard it, the knife still in my hand, the scent of cinnamon already filling the kitchen. I opened the door slowly, and there he was, standing smaller than I remembered, shoulders curled in, eyes not meeting mine right away. There was no wife behind him, no polished shoes, no confident posture, no carefully chosen words like the ones Chelsea used to speak on his behalf. Just him. A man worn down by something heavier than time. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, hands in his pockets, eyes shifting between the doormat and my face. I saw it in his expression. The kind of regret that doesn't need to be explained, the kind that shows up in the way someone stands still, not knowing if they're welcome or just tolerated. His mouth opened once, then closed again. There were no bags with him, no flowers, just the weight of everything we both remembered too well. I looked at him for a long moment, not with anger, not with sorrow, just stillness. A mother's stillness. The kind that sees through the surface and all the years layered on top. I spoke first, not because I owed him words, but because silence had already spoken enough. I said, regret doesn't rebuild burned bridges, but it can plant new seeds, if you let it. He nodded, just once, and finally lifted his eyes to meet mine. There was something raw in them, something unfamiliar. I couldn't tell if it was shame or longing or both, maybe even a little hope. But I didn't reach for it. I didn't ask him to come in. I didn't step aside. Not out of bitterness, not even out of hurt, but because I had learned to protect my peace like I once protected that necklace. Carefully. Quietly. without apology. Some doors stay closed, not out of anger, but out of understanding. Understanding that not every apology needs to be received, and not every wound needs to be reopened just because someone knocks. So I stood there in the doorway, sunlight falling between us, and let the silence speak again. Not the silence of dismissal this time, but the kind that leaves room for someone to carry the weight of their own choices, without expecting you to lift it for them. He thought I was fragile. He forgot who built his world, who packed his lunch every morning without fail, who stitched his uniforms when the seams came loose, who stayed up through fevers and heartbreaks and late-night knocks at the door. He forgot who held the roof steady when the wind picked up, who gave without asking, and stayed even when her own strength was unraveling. He forgot that the quietest person in the room is sometimes the one holding everything up. Betrayal from someone you love doesn't just hurt, it reshapes you. It makes you question every good thing you did, every sacrifice you made in the dark when no one was watching. But with time, you learn something else. That silence isn't weakness. That letting go isn't failure. That sometimes walking away is the bravest thing you'll ever do. Have you ever been accused by your own blood? Have you ever felt the sting of being turned into the villain in someone else's story after everything you gave? If that pain lives in you, I want to hear from you. Or if you can't find the words, just write, "I'm healing now." That's enough. Please subscribe if you felt this kind of pain. And if you're watching this alone, this light, it's for you. More love from Granny.